Good morning, Lexington. We have a story for you today coming out of Love Canal, a neighborhood located in Niagara Falls, New York, that is home to a chemical dump site buried underneath the ground. The chemical dump site contains over 20,000 tons of 200 plus different toxic chemicals. This dump site is located just below the elementary school in the neighborhood and has affected many families in the area. I'm going to send you over to a reporter who is with one of the Love Canal residents.
Good morning, Leah. I am here with Brooke, a resident of Love Canal and a victim of this environmental tragedy. Brooke, can you please tell us your experience living here?
Yes, so my family has lived here for a few years, and we started noticing the germs of chemicals coming out of the ground and weren't really sure about it. Then a newspaper article came out saying that the chemicals are actually toxic. We noticed even black ooze coming out of our basement around the 60s, and then when the article came out explaining everything, people started to realize why there were so many health effects.
What health issues were you experiencing?
Well, some of the moms from school were having miscarriages, people were suffering from arthritis, cancer, asthma, and my baby was actually one of 5 who was born with birth defects. And the press was saying that there were only about 5 cases of birth defects, but our town is actually so small that 5 cases is actually a really huge deal.
Wow, well, we are very sorry that you had to go through that, Brooke. And we talked to other residents around, the neighborhood, and they basically said that you just wanted their voices to be heard. So we're going to go ahead and send it back to Leah at the station, and she can give more background information about this event.
We're here now with a representative from the U.S. EPA, Colin Marshall, to gain some insight on how this environmental catastrophe came to be. Colin, let's begin with a brief timeline of how 200 plus toxic chemicals got to this part of Niagara Falls.
Well, Lee, in the late 1800s, William Love had a plan to create a cheap city fueled by inexpensive energy. Later on, the project failed, leaving a 10-foot canal exposed. Hooker Chemical Company took control over the land, and over time it became a municipal and industrial chemical dump site.
Okay, so are you saying that not only Hooker Chemical Company was using that land, it was the town as well?
Exactly. So the town and the local government used the dump site to dump sealed drums of chemicals. So from the 1920s to the 1950s, 20,000 tons of chemical waste was dumped into this 10-foot canal. Then the chemical company never intended for the canal to be used by the school, by residents, by the Board of Education. But in 1953, the Board of Education demanded that Hooker sell them the land.
Okay. So explain why the Board of Education needed the land.
In the 1950s, Buffalo was booming. They had a population boom, so the Board of Education needed the land to create a new elementary school. So when Hooker Chemical Company agreed to sell the land for $1, the Board of Education bought the land with the disclaimer that the land had been used as a chemical dump site for drums and other hazardous waste by not only Hooker Chemical Company but the locals and the local government. So frankly, no one thought that the toxic chemicals would seep into the groundwater and out into the environment like it actually happened.
Okay, so because they were sealed off and this was meant to be a dump site, they never thought that this whole catastrophe and all the string of events that happened was ever going to happen.
Exactly.
So,
yes.
Since they thought it wasn't a threat, tell us a little bit about how it became a threat and what triggered the release of the chemicals.
So, for a couple decades, 2 decades, the neighborhoods and the surrounding areas, the elementary school, seemed to be fine. Everything seemed to be fine. But in 1978, a large amount of rainfall, a record amount of rainfall, triggered basically an explosion of Love Canal. So when kids would play in the streets, they would play in the streets and in the grass. They would get burned. When they would throw rocks onto the pavement, the rocks would explode like firecrackers. Manholes would pop out of the ground out of nowhere, completely random. So the large amount of rainfalls help induce the seepage into and through the ground, seeping into the below groundwater, which then contaminated affected the grass, the groundwater, the water people drank, and so forth.
So because of that, it came up from the ground and was present on the surface of the ground and
Exactly.
probably near people's houses and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it sounds like most of that exposure came from contact with the skin, causing
Yes.
rashes and stuff like that.
Yeah, so when kids would play outside, they would contact with the grass, or even in their own basements, the water would seep into their basements, making their homes not safe.
So one final question for you. In your opinion, is it safe to live in Love Canal, or should the government be evacuating these individuals?
Lee, it's absolutely not safe. The people and the residents, they're having to live here, and this is being held from them. The people need to evacuate right now.
Okay. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Although President Carter has issued a state of emergency for the area of Love Canal, the emergency funds sent there have not been enough to relocate the hundreds of families that still need to be moved out of the area. One woman, Lois Gibbs, is fighting for the relocation and compensation of the residents of the Love Canal area. This is her story.
I read the newspaper article saying that there were chemicals underneath the 99th Street School and they were leaking into the community, and it all came together. My son was suffering from epilepsy, urinary tract problems, and respiratory problems. And he was just a kindergartner at that elementary school. I knew right then and there. Oh my goodness, that's why Michael is so sick. Some of the other concerned parents and myself banded together to present a petition to the superintendent of the schools to shut down the elementary school. I asked the school to relocate my son, and they refused me because, as they put it, if they did it for him, they would have to do it for everyone else. They were choosing to ignore this issue, so I went above them to the state health department. We started going around the neighborhood, door to door, collecting information on what other health effects that were amongst the residents. There were a whole list. That list included birth effects, miscarriages, cancer, and so many others that affected the school children, their families, and even people who were not frequently visiting the school. Even with this data from our health survey, they chose to evacuate only families with pregnant women and children under 2. This was a few months ago in August. 200 families is a start, but there are so many of us left. I was furious that the rest of us were being ignored and left in a dangerous area. Just after this, I decided to organize the Love Canal Homeowners Association. It is kind of a support group for all of us, and we're using it as a way to sort out who wants to be relocated, who doesn't, and how we can work together to have our voices heard.
After 2 years of battling with powerful politicians within the local, state, and federal governments, Lois Gibbs' dreams were realized. On October 1st, 1980, President Carter issued a second state of emergency for the Love Canal area, and the remaining hundreds of families were relocated. The federal government paid out a grand total of $137 million to Love Canal residents for the cost of relocation and damages incurred. Additionally, the state of New York and the Occidental Petroleum were required to pay towards the cost of relocation, environmental testing, and cleanup in Love Canal.
Good morning, Lexington. We will be revisiting a story from the 1970s in a neighborhood of Niagara Falls, New York, where an infamous environmental catastrophe occurred many years ago. It appears that the state of New York has deemed this area of Love Canal safe for repopulation. It was once ridden with thousands of toxic chemicals, and they have determined that all the chemicals are out of the area. A former housewife turned environmental advocate, Lois Gibbs, is infuriated by this decision. Here's what she has to say today.
I mean, we said it so many times, don't bring people back here. Just don't bring them back here.
Lois Gibbs, who led the Love Canal relocation fight, returned in 2013.
This was one of the areas that was most contaminated.
Gibbs has long argued families should never have returned.
We surely are wishing all the best to those in the Love Canal area and hope it is in fact safe to return. It appears that this issue does not hit so far from home, as there was an issue involving a toxic chemical dump site right here in Kentucky. Valley of the Drums was located in Bullitt County near Louisville, and the property was owned by Arthur L. Taylor. This chemical dump site was known in the 1960s, but at the time it was an unprecedented issue, and local officials didn't know how to handle it and didn't have any funds to clean up the site. Drums of toxic chemicals were tossed in a somewhat secluded area and left unmanaged for many, many years.
These two foregoing events contributed to the development of a well-known federal program called the Superfund. The Superfund, also known as the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, was passed in December of 1980. As we know, it has been a key act contributing to the control and cleanup for some of the United States' worst environmental disasters, including undamaged waste sites on the national priority list. Love Canal sparked the federal government's drive to locate and address other chemical waste sites across the United States.